Our second speaker is Dr. Josh Fisher from JPL. Josh is a climate scientist and head of the EcoStress mission. He focuses on terrestrial ecosystems, water, carbon, and nutrient cycling using a combination of supercomputer models, satellite and airborne remote sensing, and field campaigns from the Amazon to the Arctic. Josh received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Berkeley, then did a postdoc in Oxford where he also taught for a while, and he's been at JPL since 2010. Josh.
Thanks, Rody. Thanks for having me here. I gave a talk to the League of Women Voters on climate change a few years ago, so I don't know if any of you were at that one. And usually at events like this, I give a general climate change talk, but that was pretty well covered by the first speaker. Rody asked me to kind of give a different perspective on, the climate change issues in terms of just kind of getting a little bit of a deep dive into some of the science we're working on. Not necessarily the emissions and the impacts and the economics, which we typically talk about, but some of the actual science that we work on as climate scientists into the nitty-gritty in terms of really understanding how the planet works and what climate change is doing to it. So I'm at JPL. I work with a lot of different climate scientists. My focus in the climate system happens to be on the land, ecosystems, water, carbon, and such. I work with atmospheric scientists, I work with ocean scientists, but my focus is on the land. So I'll talk about some of the issues about what we're asking in terms of the fate of our terrestrial biosphere, where we actually live and what we depend on. So the terrestrial biosphere is actually the smallest part of the Earth, if you think about it. Most of the Earth is the ocean or the atmosphere. And we live on this smallest part. But the terrestrial biosphere, all the forests and the grasslands and the agriculture and so on, they actually exert an enormous influence on the Earth's climate. The uncertainty in terms of what's going to happen to the fate of the biosphere dominates our uncertainty in climate, in future climates. How could that possibly be? It's kind of like the Princess and the Pea fable that Hans Christian Andersen wrote in 1835. About this small little pea that basically was detected by the princess, and it was the test of her royalty. And that small little pea is essentially the biosphere, and what it does can detect the outcome of what's reality and what isn't. So, in terms of our we talk about the future climate or the future projections. They come from models, mathematical models that describe the physics of the Earth system. Models being mathematical equations like Newton's apple. How long is it going to take for the apple to hit the floor? Well, we know something about the laws of gravity and maybe some friction or mass, and so we can predict it based on mathematical equations. Now multiply that up by enormous amounts about every drop of water and CO2 and leaf and atmospheric constituent. These are all represented in our supercomputer models, the land being one of the parts of them. So basically what it does is we take some land, this is land, obviously, and we throw some weather at it, and up pops an ecosystem, right? And okay, so if you change the rain or the temperature, then the ecosystem changes. And so what do these ecosystems or what do these plants represent? They represent micron small pores, like stomata, which basically allow CO2 into the biosphere and release water. That gets scaled up to the scale of the planet. And so how do we do that is a very tough challenge, both mathematically and observationally from space. And actually, to follow up on the last question, I think someone asked, well, what about carbon sequester, geoengineering type ideas? Well, the terrestrial biosphere is our biggest source of drawdown of CO2, and so that's what we work on. So we're working on understanding the pores. When are they closed? When are they open? how do we understand photosynthesis and the electron transport and the biochemistry? How much water comes off of leaves, which, you can't see the water coming off the leaves, so I put a little geyser here so you can pretend there's water. So these processes at the scale of the leaf have to be scaled up to the scale of the canopy. Not all leaves are created equally. And how do you model that across the entire planet? Light gets diffused through canopies at different rates and heats up the land at different rates and can be measured through thermal measurements detected from space. The land intercepts rainwater to evaporate easily back to the atmosphere instead of going into the soil for other storage. The land interacts with wind and energy in the atmosphere in terms of how wind gets cycled around. Yeah.
You need to speak better.
Oh, sure.
We're old, we don't hear as
Yeah,
well.
I can speak up a little bit. How do we actually model when leaves drop? That's carbon, right? So it's the carbon that the biosphere has mopped up from the atmosphere, a great ecosystem service to counteract our bad services of emitting these CO2. And then it kind of gets stored into soil at longer times and new leaves come on again. How do we actually characterize plants in models? Because we can't actually model every single species, that's too much. So we have to kind of group plants together. And how we decide how to group them really influences how we describe the planet. How much carbon is being consumed by plants? We know that carbon is taken up by plants, but they actually burn that sugar off for normal metabolism, just like we do. Some plants grow faster than others or more than others. We've got to be able to figure that one out. And where do the plants put their carbon? Is it in leaves, or is it in roots, or is it in stems? So we have to figure that balance out, because if it's in wood, it'll stay down longer. If it's in leaves, it'll decompose and go back to the atmosphere quicker. So we have to kind of get that right. How much water comes through that isn't intercepted and gets into the soil. And then these soil layers, there's a lot of soil layers, and they're all made up of different carbon until you get the bedrock. And in some places, like in the Arctic and the tropics, there's enormous amounts of carbon stored in the soils, and we got to get that right, especially as the permafrost in the Arctic is warming and thawing back, and a lot of that soil carbon is being released back to the atmosphere. There's nutrients, of course. Plants can't grow forever, and so they need nutrients. We have to get that right. How fast do leaves decompose and return to the soil, return to the atmosphere? What about all the bugs in the soil that kind of eat and break down all that dead plant material and respire that back up to the atmosphere? That's the major source of CO2 back to the atmosphere in a natural ecosystem setting. How do we integrate all these ecosystem components? And these are measurements we can conduct from towers that integrate the soils and the grass and the leaves all together. Snowmelt. A very tough process to model as heat kind of breaks down that soil. We can see snow and we can not see snow, but actually how do we melt snow is a very difficult modeling process. How does water get deeper, from the surface layers into the deeper groundwater? And also how does it evaporate back up to the atmosphere? And all the evaporation from the soil through the plants, can we detect and model that? How does water run off either into the oceans or into our reservoirs, into our streams? We have to understand competition between species. So, I put some boxing gloves on them so you can pretend that they're competing for that plot of land. So, some species will be more competitive under a warming or a drying climate than others. And we've kind of got to get that right in the models to predict the future biospheric change. Establishment. We think of establishment typically in forestry as, if we chop down a forest, or if there's a fire or something, which species colonize that plot of land first. But now in a climatic sense, as there's warming up in there's warming, new species can move into places they weren't able to survive before, in as much as species that could survive in a certain temperature setting cannot survive there anymore. How do you kill a tree? That's actually a harder question to answer than one would realize. Obviously, you can chop down and such, but do trees die because they run out of water? Or do they run out of carbon? Remember, they have to eat their carbon, they have to metabolize. And if they shut those stomata because they don't have enough water, they might starve to death in as much as they can dehydrate to death. Disturbances are changing rapidly as the planet heats up, dries out. Invasive beetles kind of break down the defenses of plants, and so we're trying to get the fire aspect right, which of course has a tight interplay with the human dimension. So all these processes get wrapped up into this model of the planet. And of course we know that the world is a lot more complicated than this picture. It looks, more like this. So, how do we represent all these processes? And so that's a lot of the work that we do. Of course, we throw one more monkey wrench into this whole puzzle, right? It would be all great if we just understand how ecosystems, forests, agriculture, grasslands operate. But now we've got this. And I don't even have to put axes on this anymore. This is, you could probably buy this as a necklace or something. But this is the CO2 rise. So in the atmosphere, and how does this affect the functioning of our biosphere, the lungs of our planet? So a lot of my work revolves around this interplay between water, carbon, nutrients, and climate. And you can look at it from a number of different perspectives. I look at it from a vegetation or ecosystem-centric perspective. And I'll just give you a little bit of flavor into some of the research among these three axes of the interconnecting triangle. So if we think about the fate of ecosystems, there's two extremes. One is that the ecosystems thrive and do great, and one is that they collapse. And our climate models actually don't know what's going to happen. So each color line here is a different climate model from France, from Japan, from the US, from England, and so on. So every country's climate model that they're investing, all their brilliant minds into, there's very little agreement. And that's because, CO2 is actually good for plants, right? Just like oxygen is good for us. So if you give a plant more CO2, it'll grow better. And we all know we're increasing CO2 in the atmosphere. Of course, then there's the climate impacts of more CO2, which is drought, especially. And plants don't like drought. So the models that are more sensitive to CO2 being a good thing are saying, the ecosystems are going to thrive, and the models that are more sensitive to saying, there's going to be more droughts and that's a bad thing, are having the ecosystems crash. So this is one of our big driving scientific lines of inquiry and research in our scientific community is you've got CO2, what we call CO2 fertilization on one side, and climate, CO2 caused climate droughts on the other side, and they're fighting against each other. Who wins? So some of the work we're doing at JPL is we're actually taking every country's models and running them on our supercomputers at JPL to eliminate a lot of the setup differences and just kind of have a lot of controlling factors so we can really understand the physics and nail this down. To test these models, though, there's some models. How do we test them with actual data? It's actually really hard. So here is a plot of all the land on the planet. And the x-axis is latitude, so you can see there's more land in the northern hemisphere. And now here is the breathing of the biosphere, the blue line. That's how much carbon's coming into ecosystems. Most of it's going into the tropics, as you would expect, the Amazon especially. But this is the total amount of carbon that's in the ecosystems. There's actually two poles of the carbon cycle. There's a lot of carbon in the forests of the tropics, but there's also a lot of carbon locked up in the Arctic. And so this is essentially what we need to sample and measure to know what's happening, to reduce our uncertainties. But we live in the northern hemisphere, in Europe, in America, and that's where most of the money is, so that's where we sample. We don't sample in the tropics. We don't really sample in the Arctic. So we're actually missing a lot of the major breathing and strength of our terrestrial biosphere from ground measurements alone. It's hard to measure in the Amazon and the Arctic too. That's where NASA comes into play, and we can observe a lot of these features from space across the water cycle, across the carbon cycle, the nutrient cycle. And so now how do we mix these measurements that we can see from space with the models that we're trying to do as an international community to understand the fate of the terrestrial biosphere and the planet. So as a case example, the kind of the prime jewel of terrestrial ecosystems is the Amazonia. It is that really big biological pump of oxygen to us that we breathe, CO2 drawdown. And so a first question would be, well, what is the fate of the Amazon? What's going to happen to the Amazon? And the models say that the Amazon forest is going to die back, some of the models. And so that's pretty worrisome. These are our lungs, right? We don't want that to happen. Again, models predicted in the future. How do we know if it's going to be real or not? In 2005, the worst drought in the history of the Amazon hit the region, or in the history of our records, hit the Amazon. And so we thought, well, okay, maybe this is an indication of the future. What happened? The early studies from space said that the Amazon greened up. Well, that's weird. There's a drought. And they kind of argued that, well, you know, there was maybe less, there were fewer clouds and still plenty of water in the soil, and you know, so the ecosystems actually got more light, so they could photosynthesize more. But it was still very much kind of a head scratcher, and you know, we didn't really understand it on the ground. So a team that I was part of really kind of assessed what is drought. Is it just less rainfall, or you know, how much soil moisture was there in the ground? And it's not just about less rainfall. You need to know about the evaporation, right? It's like a bucket. So you've got rain in, and you've got evaporation and transpiration out. And so we need to understand the evapotranspiration and precipitation. We had the Tropical Rainfall Measuring Mission at the time to get the precipitation, so we were able to get that. And then I've done a lot of work on this evaporation and the evapotranspiration part to get how much water is actually coming out of the ecosystems. And so we were able to get that. So when we put it all together, if we look at the rainfall over, you know, the 10 years prior to this drought, we can see it dipped in 2005, but if we understand the evaporation, the actual drying of the soil, and the impact on the plants, we can see, was it actually a drought or not? And so we were able to detect and understand how droughty it was. But not good enough, right? You need to know death. Did trees actually die? Now, how are you going to get that from space? We couldn't figure it out, so we went into the Amazon. And we spent years collecting census data, measuring thousands of trees, recensusing them after 2005 to see which trees died, and were those death rates related more to drought or not. And sure enough, as you would expect, as drought increased, trees died. And so it kind of went counter to this green up story. Remember, their paper said the Amazon rainforest greened up. So a few of those authors, after our study came out, kind of broke rank and reanalyzed their data and thought, well, maybe they had a problem with their analysis, and they came out with a new paper that said Amazon rainforest did not green up. So, so it's very much still like a line of inquiry here, and there's been scores of papers since then, but it's really just, you know, we're trying to understand. This is a critical question of what's going to happen to the lungs of our planet. In the meantime, I told you 2005 was the worst drought in the history of our records to hit the Amazon. And these climate models are predicting more droughts, more intense droughts, more frequent droughts to hit, and that's why it's crashing. 5 years later, just in 2010, an even worse drought hit the Amazon. So these climate projections are starting to play out before our eyes. Now, in 2010, unlike in 2005, we were a little bit more prepared, and we had a whole suite of new satellite observations, new capabilities to be ready for this. We have something called fluorescence. We can now measure the glow of plants from space. Previously, we could just see if they were green or not, you know, if they were there or not. You could have a green plant. It might not be photosynthesizing or not. You don't know that until it's dead. We can now detect the actual photosynthetic machinery of the chlorophyll in the leaves from space. And that's an exciting new measurement, and we're doing a lot of work on that right now, the fluorescent glow of plants, that you can see if, you know, it could be green and not doing anything, or it could be green and doing something. Fluorescence now tells us that. We've also developed at NASA something called the Carbon Monitoring System, where we've combined our efforts across the ocean observations from chlorophyll or from plankton and the marine life, to the land of ecosystems, to the atmospheric measurements, to the anthropogenic emissions out of cities and power plants and cows and everything else that we do. So we've now combined these all together, integrating our observations across the Earth system and our models across the Earth system. So before, you might have something from an atmospheric model that says, okay, we predict this chemistry to occur, or the land or the ocean. Now they're all integrated and really tightly what we call constrained by the observations, by the measurements from space, to really reduce that uncertainty. I've talked a lot about the tropics and the Amazon. We're also doing a lot of work in the Arctic and boreal region. That region has the most land mass, you remember. So if it's warming, you could potentially have a whole bunch of trees and shrubs growing where they couldn't grow before, or longer into the season because they were just too temperature limited. Or you could have all this old carbon that was dead and stored in the soil now being eaten by all the bugs that are now, warm and having a party, and respiring all the CO2 back to the atmosphere. Again, which one wins? It's always this fight between carbon in and carbon out. There's a lot of methane up there as well, trapped in the permafrost, methane being way more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, 100 times by some measures. And that's methane bubbles trapped, free from climate warming. That's all thawing back, being released, and causing, it's like opening Pandora's box here, or waking kind of the sleeping dragon. You could chop down a tree, which is bad, but you could also regrow it and get that CO2 back. With this is thousands of years of carbon in the form of methane. The models, again, are all over the board when it comes to this. This is a map of Alaska, and red is carbon out, and blue is carbon in, and each map of Alaska is a different country's model, or a different model. And you can see every kind of pattern exists. It's like a giant game of Twister where nobody agrees with each other. Some people think Alaska is going to just shoot off all this carbon, and some models think, oh, it's going to take in all this carbon. So there's a lot of work to be done. So NASA just launched a 10-year program, which is kind of unheard of for funding agencies. Usually we operate on like 3-year cycles, to really tackle the Arctic and boreal region hard. We've just selected a few dozen teams to really go out, NASA scientists to go out into the Arctic and measure on the ground all the things that we have no idea what's going on, and link that to what we're seeing from space. Okay, moving on, talk a little bit about water. No stranger to us in California. We have a lot of uncertainty on our water resources. This is kind of our lifeblood. And so what causes this uncertainty? Well, there's the water cycle. There's rain and snow that comes in. There's evaporation and transpiration that goes back to the atmosphere. Some of that water stays in the surface soil moisture. Some of it gets stored in our deep groundwater aquifers that we can tap with wells. And some of it runs off to the ocean or to our reservoirs. All of these components lead to our uncertainty in our amount of water resources. We can now, for the first time in the history of humankind, measure every single one of these water cycle components from space or remotely. I told you about the TRIM for tropical. We actually just expanded that to the global. It's called GPM, and now it's very international, and we're really tackling the precipitation hard. It's very new, just a couple of years, in this constellation of satellites, really nailing down our precipitation well. We can get our snow, we can see it or not. It's hard to figure out how deep it is. We're able to do this with an airborne mission called the Airborne Snow Observatory, run out of JPL, and where we use lasers to detect how deep the snowpack is and how dark it is, which tells us how fast it'll melt and how much water we'll get. Talked a little bit about the evapotranspiration, which is one of my main fields of expertise. This is by tracking the energy that is used to evaporate water. We just launched the SMAP mission, the Soil Moisture Active Passive mission, and that uses a giant radar, or it was supposed to use a radar until the radar broke, but we have another backup part of it that kind of probes how much moisture is in that surface, where all the roots are, and the water that evaporates and interacts with weather or flooding and whatnot. So we just launched that out of JPL. We can actually detect the deep groundwater, deep within our aquifers, or that was there until we pumped it all out, using gravity. We can measure, mass pulls objects closer, right? So the Earth is a giant ball of mass. If you have a bunch of water in an aquifer, there's more mass there, there's more stuff there. And we fly these twin satellites around the Earth, and they get pulled to the Earth more or less at a very sensitive centimeter scale, depending on how much mass is there. And if we've pumped out all the groundwater, the next time they fly over, they'll get pulled to the Earth a little bit less than they did if there was more groundwater. So we can actually detect our deep groundwater using a very interesting gravitational detection. We can measure the river discharge using the same laser technique as we do with the snow. If the rivers are higher, there's probably more water in it. Right now we have this as an airborne capability, but we'll be putting this up in space closer to the end of the decade. So we can now measure from space all of these components, which really starts to reduce our uncertainty in the water cycle. And of course, there's never zero uncertainty. This is just a cartoon. And then climate, of course, plays a big impact on that too. But just some of the work we've been doing on the hydrological cycle with remote sensing in models at JPL, integrating these all together. I'm even working on like a phone app system to get these data to the general public, to Farmer Joe, to farmers in Africa. And so I'm working with artists to kind of create an interface between art and science. We look at this across multiple scales. There's huge amounts of variability across landscapes, and we can detect using different technologies, whether it's towers or drones or aircraft from space. An example using the evaporation, which I do a lot of work in. I've built probes that I can stick into trees to measure how much they're using in terms of water. We can mount instruments on towers to integrate across ecosystems. We're running drones over farms as well as through forests to measure areas that we can't necessarily do so easily by foot or by hand. We've got airborne capabilities that we can fly over regions, especially under climate events like droughts or heat waves and such, and we can detect how much water is being used by different fields or how stressed different plants are. And we just launched, or we just got selected a new mission called EcoStress, which I'm the science lead for, and that's going to go on the International Space Station, and that's going to look at heat stress and water use from plants all over the world at 70-meter resolution, which is basically like here, we can see 70 meters. And since it's on the International Space Station, we'll be able to do something that we haven't been able to do before from our normal traditional satellites, which is get the diurnal cycle. If there's water stress, plants tend to shut those stomata down in the afternoon. We know that happens from field studies, but we don't know where that's happening globally or why it's happening, and we'll be able to do that with EcoStress, and that's going on board the International Space Station. And because our spatial resolution is so fine, we'll actually be able to detect differences between species, and which species are dying first because of water stress or because of infestation or so on. So that was a little taste of the water cycle research we're doing, and I'll finish on some of the nutrient cycle stuff we're doing. So coming back to this iconic plot, if we now paint on the equation for photosynthesis that plants use. Plants use CO2 and water with light to make oxygen and biomass, sugars, carbon. So where does this red plot, where is this red plot in this equation? It's right there. So if you had water, and obviously we have lots of light, what does this mean? Does this mean that our biomass is just going to go up infinitely as our CO2 emissions go up infinitely? Well, we know there's a bit of a problem there. That can't actually happen, no matter how much love you give your garden. But the models don't know that. The climate models have the biomass and the production continuing to go up into 2100 over the next 100 years or so. And so they're missing something, and it's the nutrient cycle. Right, you'd have to have so much carbon stored in the biomass that you'd have trees growing off your mailbox. It's not realistic. So, it's because the climate models are somewhat new, and we started with water and energy and then moved to carbon, and now we're adding nitrogen. And if there's just not enough nitrogen to sustain the amount of growth that would be expected. So I made a survey and I asked the international modeling groups throughout the world, what have you been working on in your climate models for the last 5 years? And I put that into a Wordle, where the bigger the word is, the more frequent the response. And you can see they've been doing a lot of different things: soils, there's nitrogen in there, hydrology, land use, and so on. It's a big mix, methane, CH4. And then I asked them the same question. I said, well, what do you expect to work on in the next 5 years? And here's the Wordle for that. So you can see that this is one of those key, it's not that we don't understand it, it's just part of the cycle. We're working on that. So before I came to JPL, Rodi said I was working in Oxford in the UK, and I developed the nitrogen cycle model for their climate model. A lot of mathematics. All you really need to know is that I titled it Fun, Fixation and Uptake of Nitrogen, because we need a little bit of fun in climate models. And we tested this against a number of research sites where we were pumping CO2 onto the forest to see what happens if they were actually taking up the CO2, or if they were becoming limited by nitrogen and for phosphorus, and some were and some weren't. I also spent a lot of time in the Amazon, throughout the Amazon and Andes, conducting a fertilization experiment, putting down nitrogen and phosphorus. I was in the Amazon for about 4 years in Andes, collecting soils, collecting leaves, which is a very difficult thing to do there, and really to kind of understand how the models are working, what are we seeing from space, and what are we seeing on the ground in this very critical region. And now our models are updated, and these are some global runs. Another interesting, this is kind of cutting edge, this is my most recent paper. There's a whole underground economy of fungi that we've not really known existed, where there's basically two types of fungi, and the fungi go get the nutrients for the plants and exchange the nutrients for carbon. It's the carbon economy, but underground. And they cost different amounts, get you different amounts back. And we know this is important, but we don't know where these fungi are because it's hard to see. My latest paper, which was just published, has now been able to detect the pulsing of these forests that are associated with one type of fungi or another. Like, if you imagine these are trees with individual looks or fingerprints, we wouldn't necessarily know which fungi were associating with which types of trees. With this technique, I can now detect what I call the hand influencing different types of species, whether it's one type of fungi or another. And so we looked at this over about over 100,000 trees and found that we can map this out. And finally, we can put this all together. This was a press release a couple years ago that we did, where with my team, we're starting to integrate research from the water cycle, research from the carbon cycle, and research from the nutrient cycle to really understand how ecosystems operate, how sensitive they are to climate changes and CO2, and to really understand the fate of the terrestrial biosphere. So that was a bit of a sampling of some of the work that I do on ecosystem science at JPL. It's pretty representative of a lot of the work we do in the international community as well. Of course, there's one elephant in the room that affects us all. What's going to kill the Amazon first, climate change or people? We do a lot of work on that too. And this is, I think, my last slide. And I also do a bit of social science work in terms of understanding how do we work collaboratively across the countries, across politics, across different cultures, to really understand this collective problem and this collective question of the fate of our planet. So hopefully we're able to detect that P and really confirm the true understanding of the future of our planet. Thank you.
Wonderful job. If you have a question or comment, please line up at the microphone.
Hi, good morning. So I'm hoping you can address a concern I have about all the modeling. With all of the positively reinforcing feedback loops that are being triggered, I'm concerned that the modeling doesn't really take into account exponential changes, which positively reinforcing feedback loops would create. They are rather arithmetic or linear in nature.
Yeah. So I guess to kind of paraphrase your question, like, are the models constructed with unrealistic linear changes or more realistic non-linear changes? Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great question. That's what I ask all the time. And that's, so yeah, you're absolutely right. Some of it is like, that's the data we had and we didn't know what happens at the next step. So the models were created linearly. We're now going back to reassess the linear assumptions and updating it. And when the models were created a couple decades ago, we had limited data, and our data were not collected to understand global scale phenomena. Now they are. And so we're reassessing the climate models, what we call in this data revolution, this data information age. And we're going out and collecting everything with the understanding that everything is not necessarily linear. So for instance, the Arctic processes here, we're collecting the data to really characterize the shape of response functions across linear and nonlinear responses. And so, yeah, we're working on it.
Would you hazard a guess as to the percentage of, we need to get the models up to this level of exponentiality, whatever I want to call that?
Just in terms of linear versus nonlinear.
A rough
aspects?
guess of what percentage, like we're 5% of the way there. We're 50%.
Well, it really depends on, which institution, right?
Oh, yeah.
The French are
How
at that
about
level.
your work?
My work is very good, of course. Actually, all the model development I work is across nonlinear modeling. That was how I was raised in my education at Berkeley, was to question the nonlinear aspects. And so as I became a practitioner as a scientist, it's really been that way. So I think my work has influenced my colleagues' work to think that way, as well as to, with this above program, the Arctic, I actually was on the leadership team that created the program. And so I'm the lead modeler of the entire program. And so now I'm directing all the field teams to collect the data across an understanding of nonlinearity. Great. That's just the US work. I engage with the French, I engage with the Brits,
Right.
And so I can't quite give you an answer across the international community, but we're getting there, and it's an absolutely great question. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Hi, I'm with Whittier Area Uptown Association, and we are going to be putting on an Earth Day on April 30th, and a street fair, and we need to get some electric vehicles. Craig Hover's bringing a hydrogen vehicle, and so if anybody has a Tesla, a Chevy Bolt, or a Nissan Leaf that they could bring on April 30th in Uptown Whittier on Greenleaf Avenue between 10 to 2. I will be up at the front. I have some cards. There's also some cards about it on the Citizens Climate lobby table.
So that was awesome. It's like a commercial, to my show. And it makes me seem more official. It's like a sponsor. Actually, JPL for Earth Day, JPLers were all like technologically driven. Every new electric car that comes out, some JPLers bought it. And so for our Earth Day, we put out all the electric cars on our main quad area. And it's very cool because it gets bigger every year.
Hi, I'm Marcielle, and two things. First of all, can we get your notes online? Do you have a web page that we can read further?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want,
Look up your
I don't know if
name.
you want. It's a lot of technical detail, but I do have a website. I can. If you just type Josh Fisher into JPL into Google, I'll be the top hit.
Great.
But I've published over 100 papers, almost.
And then
100
this is
papers.
just for everyone. I've always thought we could all create sort of a mass compost program where all of us, because I'm always throwing my banana peels away, I try to compost on my apartment porch, but there's so much that we could do as a planet. I just want to put that out there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the previous speakers' kind of messages of what can we do to help, and there's a ton that we can do to help, whether it's composting, changing light bulbs, or changing our elected officials. That was actually more poetic than I realized.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Guido Rivero. I have a simple question. We know that the trees don't have to go shopping, right? Because they produce their own energy, their own sugar through the photosynthesis
That's right.
and
Yep.
chlorophyll. Will producing more trees help us combat climate change because they produce oxygen?
Yeah,
How much
absolutely.
per
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's our main vacuum cleaner of all the CO2 junk we put up into the atmosphere. So yeah, more forests, more trees could draw down more CO2. The question is it enough? And you also you don't want to plant like a tropical tree in England kind of thing. So you kind of have to be a little bit smart about that, or not even smart, just common sense. And then trees, once they kind of get to that old growth stage, they might not be that productive and they might start to decay. So there's these kind of forestry questions that happen. But if we think about the CO2 that we're burning, that's not like a single tree that we're burning for wood. That's like thousands and thousands of trees compressed into a tiny ball of coal or oil. And so to plant one tree to take that amount is not enough. It's definitely something we've got to do because it's our only way to get CO2 out. I mean, some of the CO2 dissolves into the ocean, but that's our only way to get large-scale CO2 back out of the atmosphere. It'll take time.
Last question. Sorry, Carol, just one more.
Oh.
Good morning. Thank you for your very informative presentation. I found it really intriguing about the equation of drought, how you looked at all the different factors, as well as the exchanges between the fungi and the roots. That was really intriguing. But I work with a lot of engineers in terms of coordination for our projects, and by nature, they're very inward. They're very technical savvy. They don't necessarily have an external advocacy or sharing of BMPs or very best management practices. And so my question is really rooted in terms of something you touched briefly, but to expand on the role which you're doing with JPL in terms of how scientists can have a more role in public policy. And the second part of that is really like some of your educational programs, how that not only can inform the youth or the emerging leaders of tomorrow, but also to inspire action. So I'm just curious if you can really elaborate on that.
Yeah, I also work with a lot of engineers. JPL has about 5,000 people and 3,000 of us are engineers. 500 of us are scientists, so I'm part of the minority. So you got a two-part question. Let's see if I can remember. It's how do scientists kind of get more involved in influencing policy?
Yeah, in your opinion, yeah.
And then the other one was what was it? The
Educational programs,
like how to
inspiring
educate.
action, yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously that's not my research, so this is just my personal opinion. Disclaimer, not JPL represent. Scientists in policy, it's an interesting question, right? Scientists kind of know what's happening. The Obama administration put a lot of scientists the most scientists into his administration than any administration before. Were they successful? Scientists are good at science, not necessarily good at policy. We know our engineering, we know our science, we don't necessarily know people. If you look around, like we are the introverted, can't talk to someone looking in their eyes kind of thing. So how are you, so there is this kind of disconnect between what we're really good at and a field that we think we could be good at and we're actually not. So that's not to say that every scientist is like that. So it's definitely a challenge. It's not such, a lot of people ask me, we need more scientists in policy. Well, get to know our scientists. We're not that good at policy. Some of us are, and absolutely we should try to facilitate that more, I think. I mean, that's my opinion. I would want to see data of, do scientists actually do a better job at getting policy as a scientist? A good 5-year PhD as the planet goes to hell, kind of, sorry. No, I'm just kidding. So the other part of your question was how do we educate the youth and kind of establish the education programs to really change the world? I mean, that's what forums like this are about. I think, we're preaching to the choir here, in California, in LA kind of thing. As our previous speaker said, getting into those Republican offices and choosing he said exactly that, choosing the rhetoric and the values and the language that appeal to, to the group that potentially is most opposed to that type of change for other reasons. Getting into the red states or the red dots in the blue states. So when I give my climate change talk, my general climate change talk, it's not to the left, it's not to the environmentalists, it's really to the right of center, and it's really trying to understand how the conservatives, which get a lot more exposure to kind of anti-climate change rhetoric, but are not necessarily influenced by it, can understand how their values can be aligned with environmental values. The Pope obviously doing a great job on the religious side for the Christian and Catholic, you know, and you know, we can look at the Jewish and the Muslims.
Right. And just on, well, okay. Well, I guess
Sorry.
that's that.
Talk too long.